Og að því mæltu að þá ætla ég að kynna hér til leiks Odd Eiken. Odd Eiken hann norskur að uppruna. Foreldrar hans fluttu til Svíþjóðar fyrir löngu síðan og hann fæddist þar og ólst upp í Suður Svíþjóð og hann lagði stund á viðskiptafræði í Stokkhólmi fyrir margt löngu. Hann hefur komið mjög víða við, bæði í einkageiranum og eins í stjórnkerfinu, hefur sinnt ýmiss konar stjórnunarstörfum og kynningarstörfum ekki síður, bæði í bankakerfu, tryggingafyrirtæki og ekki síður innan menntageirans. Og á árunum 1991 til 1994 var Odd ráðuneytisstjóri í vísinda- og menntamálaráðuneytinu í Stokkhólmi. Og þar kom hann að innleiðingu þessa kerfis sem hann ætlar að tala hér, þessu valkortakerfi sem að Skafti nefnir svo. Og þess utan að þá fjallaði hann ýmis mál sem að lutu að alþjóðlegri samvinnu í menntamálum, meðal annars innan Norðurlanda, og hann hefur setið ýmsum nefndum fyrir OECD og alþjóðasamtök. Ég ætla nú ekki að telja það upp, það langur listi, en ég ætla að enda þetta á því að segja að ég skoðaði svolítið hvað fjallaði manninn á netinu og sænskur blaðamaður orðaði það svo að þessi maður sem ætlar að tala núna sé svona maðurinn sem að togar í spottana bak við tjöldin í stjórnkerfi sænska ríkisins. Og að svo mæltu að þá býði þér orðið, gjör svo vel. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is for recording purposes. It's not that I not believe in my own voice. You know, it's kind of strange hearing Haraldur's presentation because as between all Nordic languages you get a word here and there, and what I understood, you said norsk. You said something about komme lång vägur, that I traveled far, but then you said something about drinkur. So I hope you didn't say that he's a Norwegian guy who traveled far and he's drunk. I hope it was something more flattering or precise than that. Time will tell. What I will do here is, my objective here is actually to tell you about the Swedish voucher reform and the experience from that. But I will also tell you about the company I represent as an example for what will possibly evolve some 10 years down the road after that kind of reforms. And in addition to all that, I will give you some personal views both on where we come from and where we're heading in the educational sector. And since I'm not really sure about what Haraldur told you, let me just start with saying a few words about myself, and I hope I'm apologized if that's the same things that Haraldur said, or if it's absolutely opposite to what Haraldur said. My version is, of course, the correct one. Some 20 years ago, I was the State Secretary of Schools in Sweden. I've been working with education prior to that, and after that, I've been working as an advisor, policy advisor for several governments and international institutions. And nowadays I'm in business, but I'm still working with education as responsible for the international operations of Kunskapsskolan education, which covers India, the US, and Southeast Asia, among other places. And one thing that is striking, so I spent like 25 years in different capacity, but meeting people, policymakers in education, government officials, but also educationalists and experts. And one thing that's striking is that one thing tends to unite educational expert and policymakers all around the world. And that's the conviction that their country and their schools are different from everything else. Whatever you tell, if you tell them about Swedish reforms, or if you tell them about something you see in one school or another country, a typical answer is always, yes, that's interesting, but you have to understand that here we're pretty different here. We're very unique. And that conviction of being different is something that is very similar. And still, this is the sector of education. An Indian classroom, a Chinese classroom, a Cuban classroom, a Swedish classroom, and a classroom in Uganda. And if I put an Icelandic classroom here, you would probably recognize that quite similar. So, still, can you find any other industry where things are so similar? Of course, the richer countries have whiteboards, and poorer countries might have blackboards, but it's still the same setting, and it's very similar. And even so, if I had been to my mother's school some 60, 70 years ago, it would still be pretty similar. Maybe it looked more like the Ugandan version than the Nordic version, but still pretty similar. And of course, the reason for this is that schools, as we know it, wherever it is in the world, has its origin from the same source. Whether it's originated in the French version or the English version, or as we in the Nordic countries, the German version of schools, it was an invention from the late 19th century, basically designed with the purpose of educating masses for the growing new industrial sector, and while doing so also kind of sort out who will be factory workers, who will be white-collar workers, and who will be academics. And that's the structure in Volksschule, Realschule, and universities as we still know it. And that has been going on for 100 years. But during 100 years, a lot of things have changed in the world, in how we communicate, in medicine, in manufacturing, in energy, and how about education? This is actually pretty much the same. And it's the same all around the world, and it's the same this basic design and structure as we had 100 years ago. And hence, we also are facing the same kind of systemic problems all around the world. Problems like the growth of knowledge in the world and increasing competition creates a kind of educational inflation. I mean, one purpose of education is, of course, to get the relative advantage of those lesser educated. And the more educated, the more people is going to universities, the lesser is your relative advantage of going to university. And when we start competing with Indians and Chinese and all over the world, of course, this creates inflation in education and also enormous stress on the current system. The lack of ability to really achieve productivity gains in education. If you have a classroom with one teacher and 30 kids, it's really hard to increase productivity, and schools all over the world have been pretty lousy in achieving productivity gains, even when they are using technology. The lack of a systematic approach to innovations. That is, when you see innovations in school, they're often done by an enthusiastic teacher within the walls of a classroom. They are very seldom replicated because the knowledge stays with that teacher. And they're pretty seldom conceptualized in order to be replicated. And of course, political demands resulting in both short-sighted politics. If you have a new government every third and fourth year, or a new superintendent, or a new municipality, and everyone wants to make their mark on the educational system, and one great reform, the kind of perspective is lost in education, and this is a problem anywhere in the world. And also when you put all the kind of regulatory demands on education, which has nothing to do with its core objective to educate kids. For instance, we're working in New York. In New York, you have regulations that says that a classroom needs to be 400 square feet. That's at least 40 square meters. And when you ask them, what's the scientific evidence for that quality of education needs classrooms of the size of 40 square meters at least? No, of course, there's no scientific evidence for that. And you can find that everywhere, where you actually have wider society or social demands put on education, which increase the burden for teachers and educators without really improving the quality of education. Or what The Economist a few weeks ago called the 3 great excuses in the world, when they made an investigation on whether these excuses for bad education are really valid. That is, underfunding, social differences, and cultural barriers. And where they found that there's very weak evidence for any of these excuses. You can find countries, less funded countries, performing better, or countries and areas where greater social differences or ethnic differences and cultural barriers performing much better than places with less. And, of course, and most important, that the school, as we know it, was designed to educate for an industrial society where we became either factory workers, white-collar workers, or academics. And that society has, since pretty many years, gone. That's not the society. The kids in today's school will most likely, according to research, be changing their profession at least 5 to 10 times during their lifetime, and completely change what they're doing or their entire profession. They grow up in a society where you're used to that everything you need to know is in your mobile phone, but that doesn't really necessarily provide you with sensibility and cleverness to digest all the facts you can get on. And all the differences in between the modern society and the society of tomorrow and the old society. And all of these things were also reasons for us in Sweden to take a pretty radical approach on reforming education some 20 years ago. We made 3 sets of reforms that was actually connected. First, we changed the system where students and pupils are allocated to public schools depending on where they live, to a system and where you can ask the headmaster whether you can change to another school for some reason. You're being harassed or your friends are going in another school for some reason. We changed that to a system where families had the right to choose whatever public school they preferred. Their local school next door, or some other school in another municipality, or some other school in your own municipality. Second, we changed the role of the national curriculum, condensing it down to a core curriculum, because we said that if we want to introduce choice, and the reason for that is to kind of get more diversity and innovations, we need to have a higher degree of freedom in doing things, in methodology and how you use your resources and your time. But when you deregulate And that's something that people tend to neglect, that when you deregulate, you have to regulate the things that you have to regulate. You have to have a much more solid and clear regulation. I mean, if in an old system where you always call the central government or the central authority asking how to do, you don't need much of a regulation. But if you have a core regulation, that needs to be very comprehensive and clear. And third, we introduced what we call the free school system, which basically said that your costs in your default public neighborhood school will follow you as a voucher, even if you go to another public school or go to a private school. And this right to, and if you're a private school accepting this voucher system, you are not allowed to charge anything extra. And you're not allowed to, and you have to be all-inclusive, because you have to serve at the first come, first serve, and whether the kid has any disabilities won't change that. And that's, of course, the voucher and the choice system. So there are very comparably little regulation on the conditions to get this license to operate. It's provided by state government, because we said that you can't provide it from a municipality government, even if municipalities are responsible for education and schools, because they are actually competitors. And we fear that if municipalities are the authorizing body, they would try to avoid any kind of competition complicating their planning horizon or their life. So the conditions are really, the license to operate is given by the state, and the conditions for a license includes things like you need to have a budget, you need to prove that you're financially stable, you need to have a curriculum, and that curriculum needs to follow the important things in the national core curriculum. And of course, you have to follow the school laws and other kind of regulatory requirements. You need to have educated teachers, and you need to have an admission policy that's in accordance to government regulation. That means it's either all-inclusive, we take everyone, first come, first serve principle, or it's something connected to your academic program, if you're a specialized music school or dance school or something like that. So, so the voucher is supposed to represent the cost you would cause if you stayed in your default public school. That way, we said that we will have a cap on, we won't create inflation. And if you're not allowed to charge anything extra, we also protect children from being used by schools or private schools for charging things that you already paid with your taxes. This means, in practice, that the private school needs to provide an education just as good or probably better than a public school, because the public school is still the default choice normally, for a cost slightly below the cost of a public school. Slightly below because as a private school you need a margin for a rainy day. You don't have the municipality budget to lean to. So you need to have a margin that you could put aside if something happens, or you need to do investments in technology or anything else. And this is pretty much, if you compare it to what they have in the US, the charter school system, there are some major similarities in the sense that it's public funding of privately operated schools. But the major difference is that in the charter school system, you have a cap on the number of licenses. You've decided in the state senate that we should have 100 charter schools in this area or 1,000 charter schools in this state. and then operators are really competing for a license to operate rather than competing for students. Because if you have a license, if you get one of these licenses to operate, you normally fill your school pretty easy. So what was the reason behind? Well, of course, this was both pros and cons were also an ideological battle, and there was philosophical and ideological reasoning behind. One was that since we have compulsory education in Sweden, but we also have compulsory schooling, which means that unlike the US, for instance, going to school for the first 9 grades is not only free, it's compulsory going to school. So you could, in theory at least, be picked up by police going there. You can't provide home education instead of schooling. And the European Act of Human Rights says that it's a privilege for parents or families to choose the education for their children. And a number of Swedish religious families went to the European Court of Human Rights and said that since it's compulsory going to school, it's not according to the Act of Human Rights if government only pays for the school if it's produced by government. And the European Court, in their decision, they didn't go with these parents, but they had a reasoning that was somewhat sympathetic to that mindset, and that was, of course, very disturbing for us. But besides, and of course, besides the more philosophical and ideological arguments, we in the bureaucracy had a more practical argument, and that is, we said that for the reason I showed you in the beginning, that education is actually a 19th century approach to 21st century problems. We need innovations. We desperately need innovations in education. And to get innovations, we need experiments. And some experiments will fail. And we've had some experience experimenting with the public school system. And the problem is that we were experimenting with a generation at the time. We tested some new methods for math, or we tested some new methodology with a generation at a time. And of course, that's a very bad way of experimenting or doing innovation. And it's furthermore, it caused a whole generation, my generation, to be extremely aversive against innovations. Schools saying that we are using textbooks from the 1940s were considered as great schools because they didn't experiment with anything. And I think that attitude is very dangerous because then you don't have any kind of driving force. So we thought that having experiments and innovations should be done on the ground in a flexible system that allows people to have different ideas and also incentivize them to, if they have a great idea that's working, they should conceptualize it and they should replicate it and expand it. They should not just keep it for themselves. And that was the reason. Also, a principle was that we thought that we have a tradition in the Nordic countries, we're a pretty low parental involvement in education. You leave your kids to the government and you expect to have a great end result at the end of the day. And we thought we need to change that. We need to have a better dialogue between families and educators. And in doing so, we need to change the balance from being the balance between local government and central government in the discussion to be the balance between the local school and its families. And in order to change that balance of powers, you need to empower families. And the best way of empower families is to give them an exit opportunity. Not because you're necessarily using it, but just as if you have 2 grocery stores, And even if you're never interested in going into the second one, you can always threat the first one by saying that if you're not listening to me, I'm going to the next store. And the same is with schools. So we said that importance with exit is the existence of it, not that it's necessarily used. And of course also that we said that if we are going over time to take this step, the growing demand for education and the need for renewal, we should open education for private capital market. Why should private capital only invest in retail stores or internet betting ideas or whatever they're doing? Why can't they invest in education? Because we need that private capital here as well, and all the great ideas and people that could do that. And as a last point, which is, I think, interesting, because when I come to the US, people ask me there, wow, this sounds like very market-oriented, radical idea. How come that you, egalitarian Swedes and Scandinavian, are doing that kind of ideas? And I usually answer them by saying, that's the very reason, because we come from a very egalitarian tradition. We don't want our system to go the way your system has gone, where rich people just opt out from the system and go to private schools. And as soon as you can afford going to private school, you go to private school. So public schools in some areas will be something for those poor people who can't afford to go somewhere else. And rich people lose interest in the system because they have their system of their own, or middle class and rich people. We think it's a strength if you have a public unifying system for a whole country. But in order to do that in a society, in a modern society, which will go in a direction for more individualism, more differentiation, or different interests and attitudes, whether you like it or not, that's the case. You need to have a system that allows for different ideas and different operators, but a unifying common financing. There was, of course, fears, a lot of fears, as this kind of reforms will have, and I think you've heard most of them, that there's some arguments all over the world that this will be an arena for extreme religious groups. Some people said that there was a lot of, what if we get Muslim schools who won't allow girls to have sports, for instance? Or what if we have all these extreme religious parochial schools? There were fears for social segregation, for luck seekers who would make a profit on kids. Some people talked about you will get Kentucky Fried Children, American chains of profit-making companies just wanting to exploit children, and that's morally wrong. And people will try to cherry pick, even if they can't have that kind of admission, they need to be exclusive. They will still try to cherry pick and get rid of children with disabilities or learning problems or anything more challenging. And even if you solve that, you will still have an inequality between those who actually use the right to choose and families who are so underprivileged so they can't even make choices, or they're not interested, or they don't educate to make choices. And of course, a lot of local municipalities said that we can't really plan, we can't take responsibility and plan education if we're not control of what kind of schools we'll establish. What happens if someone establishes a school here and all our planning conditions are really changing? And people also question, teacher unions question whether overall
performance will increase or actually decrease. So what happened then? Well, from the beginning, we had a private school system with less than 1% of the market. The typical private school was an old Ivy League kind of private school for old, very fine, upper-class families who's been going there for generations. In the beginning, very little thing happened. The only thing that started was a number of people who really had the infrastructure, parochial school. Some churches started schools. Some ethnic schools. We have a big Finnish-speaking population who started Finnish-speaking private schools. And we also had some, which was actually what the starting point for the whole reform, a number of village schools who were being closed down by the municipalities because they built big central schools and they need to feed them with kids. So they closed down village schools, and people living in the villages said that if you close down that school, this village will die. That's the last stroke against this village, so we are prepared to take over the school and run it ourselves. And they did that using this reform as a starter. After a number of years, you also got some Steiner schools, Montessori schools, existing pedagogical ideas who started schools. But then, after maybe some in the late 90s, it started to happen a different kind of schools. Entrepreneurs with great ideas. They could have been teachers, or businessmen, or school people who had some idea on how to do this in a smarter way that they have thought of, and they started their own schools. And after an additional number of years, these tended to become chains of school, because school is an activity that you're doing. You're pretty much doing the same thing over and over again in different places. So there's a lot to be gained from building a chain if you can centralize and standardize some processes and that way gain some time and money. And what's really happening now is that we have more and more private chains of schools, and some of the chains, like the one I'm representing, have become global chains or international chains. And we now have a market share of private schools of some 12%. So 30 years down the road, this is actually 20 years down the road. Time flies. You could say that the market share of private school has increased from 0.5% to 12%. For high schools, gymnasium as we call it, it's even higher. It's like 24%. In some municipalities, it's a majority of high schools are privately operated. Parents and families are generally very satisfied with their schools. Some 84% in the private school sector are very satisfied with their schools and their choice. The most important reason when you make a survey choosing school has nothing to do whether it's private or public. In private school is often pedagogical ideas, because they have some special pedagogical ideas that attract. From the beginning, you could say that both sides, both the people against this and the people for it, were actually exaggerating in the sense that some people I said that things will be better just because they're private. Private is better than public. And the other gang said just the opposite, that private is always evil, while public is always good. And you could say that today that discussion is much less dogmatic, because we've seen example of bad private schools, and we've seen examples of great private schools, and great public schools, and bad public schools. And we start discussing, which I think is a great achievement, we start discussing more and more great and bad schools, rather than public or private schools. Academic results are slightly higher in independent or in private schools. You could always argue, and I think that's to some extent true, that over time that difference will disappear, because in the beginning, people using their right to choose are really active. They are concerned people or interested in education. Even if you can't see it on socioeconomic differences, just the fact that you're actively making a choice might prove that you are more involved in education, and that might also explain. But over time, when making choices will be more and more common and people are used to making choices naturally, you will have more and more the same kind of people, and you will probably don't see that kind of systemic differences in performance. You will see differences between bad or good schools, but not systemically, depending on the ownership. However, you see some interesting tendencies. First thing is, what happened with the old private schools? All of them went into the new system. Well, they have actually changed from being autocratic schools for old, fine families, and very often low-performing kids from rich families, have turned into very meritocratic schools because they're still very attractive and elitish, but they are attracting because you have to take in people on academic performance. They're attracting elite students, a lot of them immigrants, a lot of them, some of them also from the fine old families and rich families, but they are really changing from being a kind of socioeconomic creature to a meritocratic creature. And also, what has been proved in research is that in areas where there is hard competition between different schools, all schools are performing better. Private schools and public schools are performing better. The theory behind that is probably that in some cases that mechanism forces you to close down failing school or do something radical about failing school in order to improve them and attract. And even if you're a public school, you're depending on the voucher you're getting. So you need to attract students, otherwise you're underfinanced. It also has lost a lot of its political controversy. Since 60% of all families consider this as the ability to choose or the possibility to choose education as very important, it's also accepted by all political parties, from the former communists to the conservatives. There is still a discussion on for-profit and whether, in some cases, chains of private school has been bought by venture capitalist funds in the US or in Virgin Islands, and that has been considered as pretty provocative. So there is a discussion, not on whether you could have a margin or not, because everyone recognizes that you need a margin to run a sustainable operation with that kind of time horizon, but whether you can pay dividends to your shareholders or not. That's still a controversial issue. So when you summarize that, in these key areas that were discussed when it was introduced, has it increased costs for the public sector because you will have more schools publicly financed, and some of these schools will obviously be half full or have pretty much empty seats, as you will when you have more alternatives? No, it hasn't. It's broadly accepted. Performance, over time, there will probably be weak differences between schools just because they're owned in one fashion or another fashion, but you will see that the more competitive areas where you have many schools have shown out to improve their academic performance. And also the attitude from municipalities has changed. My company, we have a principle, we only establish in areas where we are welcome and where we have cooperation with authorities. But nowadays it very often happens that municipalities say that in order to attract investments from companies, we need to have a competitive, great school situation in this area. So we need different schools, different ideas, and we want you guys to establish here. And furthermore, if you establish here, we don't need to build another school in that area. So nowadays we're often invited by municipalities rather than the other way around. And how about equality? Well, there is, because that's still a fear that this will cause segregation. It's hard to prove any problem in that way. I mean, the most segregating factor in modern society is housing. People tend to move into segregated areas. Rich people like to live among rich people and so forth. And that's extremely segregating, of course. I think there is some validity to an argument that says that when you're in a downward spiral in a school, you will have even harder problem, because then if you're a low-performing school, some of the high-performing students you still have will opt out and choose to go somewhere else where they could find better challenges. In immigrant areas, ambitious parents from immigrant families had said that we don't think if our kids go in this area with only immigrants and no Swedes, they will be stuck being a second-class citizen, so we choose to go to another school in a different part of the city, private or public. And by doing so, you will have this downward spiral for that school, and the people left behind will be the people who won't even use the right to choose. I think there's some truth to that argument, yes. On the other hand, you could morally say that, does that mean that you think it's a duty for ambitious kids from poor background to stay behind as an act of solidarity? That's not moral. You can't defend that kind of standpoint of moral. Or if you have a downward spiral on the school, isn't it better to get that out in the light, so you really force the people responsible for this school, the authorities, if it's public, or the owners, if it's private, to do something about it, close it, or change it? And so on, the discussion goes on. And how about innovations then? Well, this is an interesting part, because when I was working with this reform, that was the part I was most concerned about, getting a vehicle for innovation. And the company I represent, Kunskapsskolan, is one example of an innovative program that evolved from this reform. We started in the late 90s with this idea that there's no use doing a public school, the same kind of factory-style school preparing people for life in factories that is the dominating model around the world. That might have been logical when you educated people to work in places like this, but when life looked like this, that's not the way of doing it any longer. So we found a number of teachers who's been trying to personalize education within the framework of the regular public system, with some mixed success. And then we said that let's redesign schools from the start, and doing it in a way that you could replicate, because, as I said previously, successful schools are very often successful because they have great headmasters or great principals, and that's not a formula that's possible to replicate. And we wanted to make a chain of school, eventually over the world, so you have to be able to replicate whatever you're doing right. So we're now running 38 schools in Sweden, with some 10,000 students in Sweden. They're fully owned and operated according to an identical program, and we've been blessed by a lot of attention internationally, both in research and from policymakers and magazines. So we were invited by the UK government to establish schools in England. In England, they have a program they call the Academy Program, where they basically said, the Labour government at that time said that let's take the 200 most lousy schools, the 200 failing schools, public schools in the country, and invite new operators. Because it can't be any worse, can it? They will still be public schools, they will serve the community, they will be all-inclusive schools, and they're financed by the state, but they are operated by some other entity according to their ideas and their responsibility. And we were invited to take over and turn around a number of schools. Currently we're running 3 schools, and we're adding 2 more schools next year. And we rebuilt them, and we changed the entire program to our program. And we also had a similar invitation from the U.S., from the Chancellor of Schools in New York, Joel Klein, who said that I want your kind of school here in my city, as an example and inspiration for other schools. He has I think personally, a very interesting view of defining his role. He's the Chancellor of Schools for New York City, or he was. And that's about 2,500 schools in an area of 9 million inhabitants, the size of Sweden approximately. But he says that as a Chancellor, I don't consider myself as the chief operator of schools in New York. I'm responsible for a portfolio of schools. And in that portfolio, it should be different schools with different operators. I'm responsible for the portfolio, but I'm not the expert, or the city is not the expert in operating. We're operating some schools, but not all schools. So this is our school, a middle school located in Lower Manhattan, and it's been open for 2 years now. And we also operate in India. This is the school we're starting in Gurgaon outside New Delhi next year. Schools in India are very different from schools here. They are big. You start school at the age of 2, and then you go there to the age of 18. 2.5 is the first year in kindergarten. So you have 3 levels before first grade. You have toddler school, nursery school, and kindergarten. And you have to be, a school has to be 6 acres of land, so they're very big schools with between 2,000 and 3,000 students. All of these schools and all of our schools are based on the same program, and that starts with this: the relationship between an individual student and an individual teacher dedicated as the student's personal academic coach. Every student has at least 15 minutes a week in a one-to-one coaching session with her academic coach, which will follow the students all through school. And the purpose of the coaching session is to set goals and assess goals. So when you start school, you set your long-term goal. I want to get into university, or I want to become a plumber, or a doctor, or whatever. And then you break down your long-term goals to midterm goals, semester goals. And then in a coaching session, you break down your goals with your coach to weekly goals. What are you going to do next week in order to achieve the grades you need in order to become a plumber? And of course, you continuously change these goals. I don't know what I don't want to become a plumber. I want to become something else. But the process of setting goals, learning to break them down, assessing them yourself, is a very important process, and that's what you're doing with the coach. We started with that, and then we said that in order to do that, we need to redesign things. And over 15 years, we redesigned all other elements of the school in order to support that process. Which is a way of turning the equation around. If you consider the traditional school, it always starts with a building, and you divide the building into classrooms, and you need one adult in every classroom to look after the kids, and that gives 30 kids, and it also gives the work organization. And then it goes on, and the end factor of that equation is the individual. So here we turned it around and said, let's do it the other way around. We started with the individual, and then we design everything after that. The first thing we saw that in order to personalize, you need to be able to move in your own pace. And in order to move in your own pace, we have to get rid of grades and make it integrated. So we took the this is from our English school. We took the entire, in this case, secondary school curriculum, all grades, and in core subject divided into progressive steps, 36 progressive steps. So you could start on the level you are, and you can end on the level you want to achieve, and you can progress in your own pace regardless of grades or things like that. In some areas, context is more important than progression. So there we have integrated theme courses, such as science. But in order just not to stimulate speed, but also quality, you need to assess at every level. So we put in assessment point as every level. And these assessments are done with the teacher, or with the coach, or as presentations or tests, and it differs. But it's always the decision of the teacher whether you should progress to the next step or not. And then we realized that we need to cut down on the time teachers are spending on preparing lessons, looking for books, and how books are actually governing this progression. So we developed a web-based portal. It's basically a web page where we put all the resources, the texts, the assignments, but also the assessment rubrics. So you could see as a student when you start your step that this is what I'm supposed to achieve if I'm aspiring on this grade or this achievement. So this picture shows you an example. This is the American portal for the American Common Core Standards Middle School. Math, step 23. Here are the goals for that step, the assignments, the rubrics, and so forth. And having done that in several countries now, you see that you could even have some more advantage of that, because we now have a Swedish portal according to the Swedish Grundskola and the Swedish Gymnasium. We have a US Common Core and New York Standards portal, an English according to the English GCSE exam board, and two Indian portals. And they're all distributed on the cloud through the web, so it's available for all our students anytime. And by having all these, all schools have access to all of these. So Swedish schools are actually using the US portal. They're doing math in the US portal as part of English education. Or the English students, or the US students, when they read about the American Revolution, they said that let's go into the UK portal and see how that's presented there. And we can also combine, so we have some of the, when you read about Hinduism, of course you go into the Indian portal and see how it's presented there. And so these resources are available. Then we discovered, then we realized that you have to change more flexibility of learning formats. Instead of have the fixed class structure, we need different setups depending on the task. So we have lectures, we have base groups, we have communication sessions, and always in between, because we don't divide the working day into lessons and breaks. We have workshops going on, and that's basically office landscapes where you can sit down and work on your portal, but there are teachers walking around supporting you. And by doing that, we are able to customize the schedule individually. So you can say, when you have your coaching session, your coach can say that if you want to achieve what your goal in math, you need to spend some more time on math, and maybe you could slow down on English because you're performing really good there. So next week, let's go to some more math workshops. While the other student is the other way around and have to spend more time on English. So from the menu of the school, you could compose your individual schedule together with your coach. And as an additional factor, then you need to redesign teacher roles. A teacher in the US, in average, and it's the same amount actually in Sweden, spend 19 hours a week with students. 19 hours. And the rest in meetings, preparations. Our teachers spend 26 hours a week with students, because since we have all the content on the portal, you don't need to spend that much time on preparation, and we centralize all the processes. You don't need to spend that time on bureaucracy. You should, as a teacher, you should do what could never be substituted by anything else, neither technology nor anything else, and that's being with students, preferably in one-to-one sessions. And the same thing with real estate, that we have designed a program where we use 9 square meters in average per student, which is half of the Swedish standard, and it's less than half than the New York standard, because the way we are using flexibilities. These are some images from our New York school, and this is, you could see, things that used to be a hallway we use as a learning space, because every space in a school should be a learning space, and you should design it in a way that the headmaster could take a 5 minutes walk and see everyone and be seen by everyone. So that's one way of doing it. You might think there are other school programs having very different approaches, very different ideas, but still, I think in education there's a room for diversity, and there's a need for diversity, and this is one example on doing that in a diverse way. Thank you.